So our topic is characteristics of a poem, and this cognitive domain, it talks about the intellectual capacity of a learner, or the intellectual development of a learner. So under the creating, it is first define the characteristics of the poem, second enable students to identify the features of a poem, and under evaluating, describe each characteristics of a poem, evaluate the characteristics of a poem. Under analyzing, we have analyzed the different characteristics of a poem and modify the different characteristics of a poem. In applying, we have here apply the characteristics of a poem. Second is adopt the characteristics of a poem. In understanding, we have comprehend thoroughly the characteristics of a poem and distinguish the differences of each characteristics of a poem. Last, for our remembering, recall the characteristics of a poem and recognize the characteristics of a poem. So at the end of the topic of the characteristics of a poem, those what I've mentioned is the learning outcome under the cognitive domain.
So our topic is all about the characteristics of a poem. So we talk about the affective domain includes the way we deal things emotionally, such as feelings, values, appreciation, enthusiasm, motivations, and attitudes. Because we students do not just learn the lessons put in mind, but of course, it will somehow affect our beliefs, values wherein it can change the learners. So when talking about the affective domain, it has receiving, explains the receiving, responding, valuing, organization, and internalization. So when we say receiving, the learners just follow what is required and to do, means there's no reaction pa. Second is responding. Interaction comes na. Interaction, na ana ang interaction. When say about valuing, which is the third one, valuing is the attachment. The attachment gives importance to a particular type of a lesson. Next is the organization and internalization. So our topic is kuan man, characteristic of the poem. So when the receiving is understanding the characteristics of the poem. Second is listen for and remember the characteristics of the poem. Then, so in talking about responding, it is to perform the activity which is to create and deliver a poem. Second is to conform the different characteristics of the poem that vary to its function. So when we say valuing, shows the ability to initiate and to comprehend the characteristics of the poem. Second, able to demonstrate each characteristics of the poem by allowing the learners to construct their own poems. Organization explains the different characteristics of the poem, recognizes the function of each characteristics used in the poem. Internalization, the students will verify the function of each characteristics in a poem, then which enable them to learn. So that's it.
Good morning. Our topic is all about the characteristic of a poem. Now, to make an objectives using psychomotor skills, we have to follow the 6 domain. Namely, the first domain, we have perception. At this domain, learners can develop and modify movements into specific requirements. The learning outcomes of this domain are distinguish the characteristic of the poem, enable learners to identify the characteristic of the poem. Next, we have set. At this domain, learners have the readiness to act. The learning outcome of this domain, we have apply the characteristic of the poem. Enable learners to elaborate the characteristic of a poem. Third, we have guided response. Learners initiate the process of undergoes a trial. Therefore, the learning outcomes of this domain are classify different characteristic of a poem, apply different characteristic of a poem. Next, we have mechanism. At this domain, practice becomes habitual. Therefore, the learning outcomes of this domain are prepare the learners to construct a poem, provide a learners to develop skills in making a poem. Next, we have complex overt response. At this domain, learners can show skillful performance. Therefore, the learning outcomes of these domains are construct a poem using a characteristic, revise a poem using the characteristic given. Next, we have adaptation. Learners can perform skill are well developed also. Therefore, the learners outcomes are personalize the characteristic of a poem, explain and recite the characteristic of a poem. Lastly, we have origination. Learners enabled to create a poem and can delivered a poem. Thank you.